This episode is supported in part by Sacred Wright's public scholarship on religion, gender, and sexuality through a grant from the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation. You can find Sacred Wrights online at sacred-rights.org and the Carpenter Foundation at carpenterfoundation.us. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Welcome to Season 9 of my conversations featuring cohort members from Sacred Wrights. Since 2020, I have loved discussing the diverse array of research conducted and produced by Sacred Wrights scholars, and playlists to the previous 8 seasons are included in the link tree in the episode notes. My guest on this episode is Dr. Tazeen Ali. Tazeen Ali is Assistant Professor of Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research and teaching focus on Islam and gender, U.S. Islam, and race and religion in America. She is the author of The Women's Mosque of America, Authority and Community in U.S. Islam, from NYU Press in 2022. She is also published in Religion and Politics, now ARC Mag, The Conversation, and more. Ali is currently writing her second book, Muslims on Screen, Racism and Sexuality in Anglo-American Islam, which analyzes entertainment media projects produced by British and American Muslims. In this episode, we discuss 3 television shows, Ramy, Dubai Bling, and Muslim Matchmaker. We had a blast, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dr. Tazeen Ali. Dr. Tazeen Ali, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here.
I am delighted that you're here. I'm wondering if we can just kick this off by having you introduce yourself a little bit to the listeners out there so they know a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay, yeah. So my name's Tazeen Ali. I'm a scholar of Islam and gender in the U.S. and race and religion in America more broadly. I have a PhD in religious studies from Boston University. And my first book was on American Muslim women and gendered authority, and that came out with NYU Press a few years ago in 2022. And I'm currently writing my second book on Muslim-produced entertainment in the U.S. and the U.K. So my research expertise is also recently expanded to the UK as I think about Muslims in American and British popular culture. A little bit about myself, I'm the very proud daughter of Bangladeshi immigrants and a practicing Muslim, and these are facets of my identity that really inform and enrich my work as a scholar.
Wonderful. Well, and I just have to say, our little point of connection is that you are in St. Louis at Wash U, and that is where I grew up. I grew up just a couple of miles away from where you work now. So I just had to say that because it's just so delightful whenever I talk to people who are in St. Louis, my hometown.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, that Midwest connection.
Wonderful. Well, how did you wind up becoming interested in religion in general? I'm curious a little bit about your academic and intellectual path that led you to pursue this as a career for yourself.
Yeah, I was thinking about this question, and I think for a lot of us in academia, in general, but maybe in religious studies specifically, we didn't plan our lives that way. Like, I'm not sure that little kids dream about being religious studies professors, but I don't know, maybe they do. As I'm saying this, it occurs to me that perhaps this is more of a maybe more true for people of color in academia. We're so underrepresented in the academy, especially in the humanities. So this is not a universal experience as I'm thinking because, there's so many academic families, which speaks to the importance of, the kind of networks that people cultivate. But, as I mentioned, I'm the daughter of Bangladeshi immigrants. I'm from New York. And like any good immigrant, I started my academic career with the intention to be a very different kind of doctor.
Mm.
And I did my undergrad at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in this sort of fast track BA MD program, and just ended up taking a freshman seminar in religious studies, and it was a world religions course. And I just have so much gratitude for my undergraduate teachers, like the religion studies department at Lehigh, who've actually they've become these lifelong mentors, and they really changed the entire trajectory of my life. So a shout out to them, Rob Rosenall, Mike Raposa, Ben Wright, Larry Silverstein. They're just incredible teachers and human beings. I started taking these classes in religion, and it's really fortunate to have these teachers who took me very seriously and cultivated not only that kind of intellectual interest, but also a kind of a confidence. And I think that's so important, especially when you don't see yourself reflected in the academy. It's and it just kind of grew organically from there. Like a religion major led to a master's in Islamic studies, which led to a PhD in religious studies. So yeah, I think in some ways it was very organic. But I guess yeah, that's the heartwarming piece of it, right? We should all be so lucky to have teachers who believe in us. But there is a darker side to the other piece of it, I think, in thinking about my intellectual journey. I came up
Mm.
as a post 9/11 kid. And the way that Muslims and Muslim women especially were always being talked about. And growing up in that political climate, the maybe slightly disturbing piece of his journey, if I reflect too hard, is that Islamophobia and the reality of anti-Muslim sentiment has profoundly informed my intellectual journey and research interests, right? So I think you go from, being the kid in junior high and high school explaining Islam to your white peers and teachers, to then becoming an Islamic studies professor. So maybe it wasn't the plan, but looking back, there's something kind of strange about the inevitability of it all, given the political climate I grew up and continue to live in, combined with sort of my own identity and place in the world. So even as I started by saying, "Oh, no one plans this," there's kind of level of inevitability that's a little strange to reflect on.
That's really interesting. And I love a good shout out as well. So thank you for talking about all of your mentors and important figures in your life. But I've said this on the podcast before that my first recollection of learning about Islam in general, like my first recollection of having it mentioned in my life is as a high school senior on 9/11 and hearing this word thrown at me through the TV. Like my education was so inadequate and embarrassingly absent of all things related to world religions that like I was literally learning about one of the world's largest religions on 9/11 on TV, watching it happen in algebra class. Like that's how ridiculously uninformed I was as a teenager.
I think that's probably the experience for so many people. And as I say this, and I'm throwing around words like, "Oh, it was disturbing," and to kind of think about this trajectory, but in reality, I think it would be so much harder right now to be that young and be in high school or junior high school in this contemporary political climate, because I think, and this is kind of reflected in entertainment media too. The post 9/11 moment, for me, I was in junior high school. And it wasn't it really it wasn't this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? The way this kind of hostile climate, even being in sort of predominantly white space, it was a space where I felt really confident to kind of step up as the spokesperson for Muslims and Islam, as a kind of educator. And I think that would be completely different in the way that young people today are navigating being Muslim or having a minoritized identity in majority white spaces. But I think that your experience, there's a universality to that with where Islam, enters the forefront of the American imagination and people are asking questions. And so in that sense, like really, I think I was playing teacher, in a way that I'm doing professionally now.
Yeah, yeah, it's intriguing and the darkness to reflect upon. I relate to that in my way as well. So I appreciate your commentary there as well. Let's what tell me a little bit more about your book. I know that it's probably a dissertation turned academic monograph, correct? Like I'm curious about like what's your favorite memory or takeaway of the Women's Mosque of America, Authority and Community in US Islam? How's that process been for you the past 3 years seeing this book come out into the world?
Yeah, I like that question. So this book was based in ethnography, so it's an account of the Women's Mosque of America, which is a multiracial all women's mosque in LA, and it's about how the community of women there cultivate authority, on their own terms and in opposition to sort of the patriarchal trends in their own communities, but also against the rampant Islamophobia that their communities are facing, in mainstream U.S. society. So it's the through line through my work. But it is a book essentially about authority that highlights this discursive project of the Women's Mosque, the production of women's sermons. And I analyze how the women in that community are constantly negotiating the tradition in their, readings of scripture, and they're actually reimagining in that process, um, what a mosque should be like and who it should serve. And so it's this these questions of lived religion, what Muslims are interested in, how they're reading scripture. And I think one of the things 3 years out that I've really loved is when students have engaged the book. They're the target audience, and it's been a real privilege to get to do book talks around the country and speak to students at universities where the book is being taught in their classrooms. And they always have the most thoughtful questions, and it always feels a little extra special when Muslim students have engaged it, and it inspires them to maybe think more expansively about who has ownership of the Quran, and what religious communities can look like, and their excitement that a book like this exists. And similarly, students from other religious backgrounds, when they draw parallels to their own communities, that feels really just really gratifying. Academic books, it is written for, I was thinking of students primarily in mind, students and other scholars. And so likewise, it's felt like such an honor when graduate students have come up to me at conferences and talked about how the book has influenced their own dissertations, which just makes me really excited for all the scholarship on Islam and gender in the US that's to come, that will build on this work and kind of go from there and exceed it.
How did you decide what your research agenda was going to be after the book came out? Because a lot of times, like I see professors kind of change gears a little bit after their book comes out. Where did you go from the book that kind of informed where you've gone since then?
Yeah, the themes that have sort of animated my research have always been lived religion, embodiment, like these questions of national belonging, thinking about how Muslims sort of fit into these contexts where they're minorities, racialized minorities in the US. And I had mentioned I'm thinking about the UK now as well. And so I think it was an organic transition to really thinking about how else to look at those questions. And so Muslims have really been having this kind of extended moment in Hollywood, and so I really became interested in entertainment media produced by Muslims as this source material to think about those same questions of embodiment, lived religion, what does religion look like on the ground, and how does it play into these questions of national belonging. So it totally, I think, on the surface seems like I'm switching gears by now looking at pop culture, but to me, they're projects that are very much connected, and it allows me a chance to expand my analysis, my interest in gender, right? So the first book really thinks about women and gender, and then in the second project on entertainment media, I'm thinking very specifically about masculinity and Muslim masculinity. And so it's kind of just an expansion of the kinds of questions I've always been interested in.
Well, I'm very excited to talk to you about three TV shows that anybody out there can watch. We're going to talk a little bit about Ramy. We're going to talk a little bit about Dubai Bling, and we're going to talk a little bit about Muslim Matchmaker. I'm so excited about this conversation. I have seen episodes of all three of these shows. And so let's start with Ramy. Representations of U.S. Muslims in Hulu's Ramy from the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture in 2025. Tell me a little bit about what this piece is about and why you wrote it.
Yeah, so this piece I actually wrote a while ago, but the timelines of academic publishing can be very slow, which I think will lead us to a conversation of why the other pieces were kind of gratifying to write in
Yeah.
some ways. With this piece, it was kind of my entry point into this new book project. And so the article looks at the show Ramy, which is a Hulu series created by Ramy Youssef. He's an Egyptian American comedian from New Jersey. And the article talks about how this show is a real kind of disruption of representations of Muslims in US entertainment media. It's thinking about how young American Muslims are navigating particular social norms of sexual ethics, of dating, and the pursuit of marriage. I think the thing that I'm really drawn to in the show and compelled to write about it, and this is a show that features very prominently in my new book project across many chapters. It's because it's a show that really resists defining Muslims through Islamophobia. So it's this kind of, I feel very, the show is many things. It's crude, it's cringy, I wouldn't even say it's my kind of comedy or that I enjoy all aspects of it, but I'm just so drawn to the way that it resists defining Muslims through Islamophobia. It really presents Islam in this kind of nuanced way that we haven't seen before. It doesn't succumb to this pressure of portraying or creating these morally exemplar or even likable characters, right? So I think there's something really powerful about showcasing different ways to be Muslim, and one way of doing that is to have this deeply unlikable but sympathetic Muslim character who's kind of just navel gazing, being self-destructive, and we haven't seen characters like that. And so it feels like it's relieved itself of the unspoken pressure to be sort of a model minority, and I think that's really powerful.
Yeah, well, and there's so much commentary in the show about gender as well. Like you see the way that Ramy's parents treat him versus how they treat his sister, and how there's like an unfair element of control between the expectations between the two kids. You also see Ramy dating early on, like a woman who's Jewish, and like seeing how he treats her and things like that. There's so much interesting stuff in there that I was watching. I was like feeling like moments of discomfort while watching it myself, but also these moments of like hilarious events in the show. And I found it to be a really intriguing portrayal as well. Something I had never really seen before whenever I was watching, television series about religion that depict religion in certain ways. This felt pretty new to me when I first started watching it in 2019.
Yeah, that's such a good point too, because it's not just this new depiction of Islam. It is a kind of innovative, groundbreaking portrayal of religion more broadly. We don't really see religion being portrayed in this kind of positive way where it's weaved in to the main character's life, as opposed to sort of something that needs to be overcome in order to be sort of a proper, secular subject. And so, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really great point.
Do you like Ramy? Are you a fan of the show?
I am. I think that writing books takes a really long time, and I think that, I all of the source materials that I engage with in my book are things that I'm a fan of. I think that it's just I would not be able to spend that much time with things that I didn't appreciate on some level. So
Let's talk a little bit about the some of the newer stuff you've been working on too. There's another article that you sent me called "The Costs of Having It All" on Netflix's Dubai Bling, published by Public Books. Tell me a little bit about the origin of this piece.
this piece on Dubai Bling was by far the most fun I've ever had writing anything.
Fantastic.
Um, the origins are kind of random, but also organic. So I was in the UAE last winter, so December 2023. And I went to this cafe called Forever Rose London. It was part boutique flower and chocolate shop, part cafe. I didn't know anything about the backstory of the cafe. I think I had just Googled, oh, good cafes to do work at. And I posted this photo of my toddler to my Instagram story. It's a very Instagram friendly cafe,
Yeah.
like most of the cafes in Abu Dhabi, very beautifully decorated, very empty and also kind of soulless. And my friend commented on the photo saying, "Oh, did you meet the owner of this cafe? He's really quirky and weird. He's on this show called Dubai Bling. It's terrible. Don't watch it." But I'm a fan of reality TV, and so I ended up binging both seasons as I was nursing my jet-lagged one-year-old on this trip. And I just became really hooked and strangely moved by it. And so when I tried to go on a deep dive, as I do after I get into a show, looking at reviews, there's nothing that captured my experience of watching the show, despite seeing how popular it was. It was on those like, oh, top, maybe because of my location in Abu Dhabi at the time. It was the one of the top like five shows that are streaming. And so I was really struck by, yeah, how none of the reviews that had been written about it um, even closely approximated my experience of watching the show. So that's kind of why I wrote it.
So what is the show about? If you could summarize it for listeners who haven't seen it.
Yeah, I don't know that this is a recommended watch, but it's a show about a bunch of self-proclaimed millionaires in Dubai, many of them women pursuing their business ventures, wearing really fabulous outfits, flaunting their wealth, getting involved in all sorts of dramas as they navigate their marriages and friendships and parenting and motherhood and their sort of entrepreneurial projects.
The women in the show, there are expectations that seem to be placed on them. So they're all very professionally successful, but they also all have relationships with their partners and their expectations of motherhood. Tell me a little bit about how the women in the show and how their expectations placed on them and their families gel or conflict with their own personal and professional goals. What's that dynamic like?
Yeah, I feel like I should give a caveat because I mentioned that I'm Bangladeshi, right? So I should mention as a caveat, Dubai is the UAE's most populous city. It's obviously we know it in the American imagination as this like luxury multicultural hub. But it's a city of gross inequality that's built on the indentured servitude of migrant laborers from places like Bangladesh. And so that's worth noting right off
Mm.
the bat. There's so much structural inequality and racism. And so when I think about, oh, say that it's such a moving show, this is in the backdrop of that. I mentioned it's a soulless place. It's this global hub for the ultra rich, very disconnected from not just the rest of the world, but how the city was built and how those migrant populations live in that city. But I
Hmm.
think that, as you mentioned in the question of what these women are navigating, the show actually doesn't help us think about that aspect that I just mentioned, but it helps us think about these paradoxical gendered expectations on these ultra rich women across a kind of global elite. And so when I mentioned that I was bizarrely moved by the show, it's in its capacity to illustrate these paradoxical gendered expectations as like the women that what they're going through. So they are simultaneously expected to be these capitalist like, to pursue these capitalistic ventures, and that's sort of the standard of female empowerment, even as they're expected to fulfill these kinds of more traditional roles of being a wife and very sort of active mothers. But what's interesting is they themselves, as they're managing these heteropatriarchal, ultra-capitalist norms, they're policing themselves, they're enforcing these standards themselves on each other, on themselves, and also by their men. And so I think those dynamics of women's roles in the family and the workplace really can help us make sense of like global trends that are demanding perfection from women. And as someone who's studied Muslims and Middle Eastern women for over a decade, it was really striking to me to see how universal their struggles were, given the overall trend to single out Muslim women as uniquely burdened and oppressed, and to sort of think about how universal those struggles were. And I think I mentioned at the time I was a year into my own motherhood journey and just very emotional at how quickly it was all going. And
Hmm.
I had at the time just recently transitioned back to work, but I was on sabbatical, so it was this very magical year where I was with my daughter every single day. And then as I was coming up on this time of her starting daycare, it was just this kind of weird realization of despite how out of touch these women's lives were with everyday people, I found the core of their struggles to be especially relatable as a mother. Though admittedly in kind of the inverse way, like most of the women in the show are wanting to work and pursue fulfillment outside of being mothers. And I was in a place where I was not wanting to go back to work. But nevertheless, I think it's just kind of showcasing that dynamic in ways that I think are actually quite relatable to women in the US.
Yeah, there's a line in the article that really just jumped out at me and made me, as a guy, think, like, it made me stop and just ponder for a second. That line is, women can have it all as long as they are willing to do it all. And I found that line to be very striking for the article.
Yeah, I think that sentiment resonates with so many women. And I think the kinds of shows, especially reality TV, and even the way I'm talking about, I'm like, oh, caveat, because the way that, there's just a kind of, perception of reality TV, which is mostly consumed by women. It's dismissed as a kind of guilty pleasure or trashy TV. And I'm not saying that I would necessarily contest those labels. I guess I'm just not as interested in that label. I think it's anyone's prerogative to call it trash TV or guilty pleasure. But I do contest the idea that these shows don't have cultural relevance or impact in the public discourse. And so
Mhm.
I think reality TV, especially those that are about marital and family dynamics or dating shows, like they reflect a lot about our culture and where we are as a culture. And I think women are more professionally successful than ever before and also more overwhelmed and overburdened. And so I think reality TV, even if it might appear as an unlikely medium to help us think about these issues, are actually a um, really rich source to do that.
Interesting. Well, let's chat about one more show. You mentioned dating. This is a perfect one, perfect segue. Get Married or Chai Trying from arcmag.org. Dating with Intention on Hulu's new series about the romantic lives of American Muslims. Of course, I'm speaking about the show that is Muslim Matchmaker. Tell me a little bit about the origin of this piece.
Yeah, I mentioned I'm a reality TV fan, pretty unapologetically. Like I loved Indian Matchmaker. I love
Yeah,
watching
that was
Love
a
is
good one.
Blind.
I
Yeah.
watched it too.
And so yeah, they're good entertainment, but they're also I think just really interesting to think with. And so I was excited when a Muslim version of that of this show was coming out. It's the same producer and creator of Indian Matchmaker. And that same producer was also involved in Jewish matchmaking. Um, from on Netflix. And I just wanted to review this Muslim Matchmaker show in my capacity as a scholar of Islam and gender in the US, but also as a fan of reality TV and other dating shows. Sometimes I think that when people, and I think this was my experience of like looking up like what had been written about Dubai Bling, um, it's often written by people who don't enjoy the medium or they're not fans. And so I think
Mm.
it just seems like a weird starting point to be writing on something that in a world that um, you're not a fan of, that you don't know nothing about, that you don't know enough about to really appreciate it. And so I felt like when I knew that this show was coming out, I felt really strongly that it was just sitting at the intersection of my personal and intellectual interests. Um, yeah.
Tell me a little bit about what the show's about because I watched some episodes the other day and I really love it.
Yeah, the show is about American Muslim singles trying to get married with the help of these two Muslim matchmakers. Um, yeah, I think that's the premise of the show. So they're
What are you liking about some of the characters on the show?
um I really appreciated the diversity of Muslims featured on the show. And not just in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, but really sort of in levels of religiosity, the kinds of professions they were in, the way that they dressed, even just their personalities. And I think most TV representations of Muslims are so static and on one note. They paint Muslims as one way, as a monolith. And so it was very refreshing and just pretty amazing to see such an assortment of characters just being their Muslim selves.
The fatigue of dating in the show really rings true for me. I've experienced dating app fatigue a couple of years back. And is that something that you feel like comes through in the show as well? Is just like this like fatigue and exhaustion of just trying to date and trying to find, your person in the world. Do you think the show does that pretty well?
I think so. And one of the things I write in that piece is that, especially Muslim Matchmaker, maybe less so. I actually haven't seen Jewish Matchmaker, but I don't necessarily feel this way about Indian Matchmaker. But I think in Muslim Matchmaker, it really brings this so-called old world concept of matchmaking into the modern world, right? It's not necessarily trying to showcase, oh, look at this kind of antiquated practice that this subcultural group, this minority group is interested in, but it's really kind of presenting it as um, a logical thing that single people might want to do after having been on apps for so long, like wanting some professional intervention. And the show, I think, introduces like the idea of really being intentional about dating and injecting a kind of structure into how to approach getting to know a partner. And so I think those kinds of rules would um, likely have a lot of appeal to single folks and encourage even those who aren't Muslim to encourage them to be very intentional about how they're approaching getting to know someone for a long-term partnership. I don't think, and I mentioned, I don't think Indian matchmaking was presented as quite as structured, but I think that folks would still be very sympathetic to kind of the exhausting nature of like date. I think that's something that would resonate with broader audiences and would sort of be presented as, oh, this is actually not a bad idea to enlist the services of a matchmaker.
Wonderful. Well, you are a part of a cohort focusing on developing your skills as a public scholar called Sacred Rights. And I just got to say that in 2025, it seems like you are just killing it with these really accessible, public scholarship pieces.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
so tell me a little bit about why you want to develop your voice to get your work out for a broader audience in the public.
Yeah, I don't have necessarily a unique answer to this. I just think, as we all know, there's so much gatekeeping in academic writing. And I think that's so unfortunate because the things that we study and research, I think, are worth disseminating to a wider readership. And I just feel like, what good is knowledge if it's not accessible and ready to be shared?
Yeah. How are you feeling the your skills, which are already impressive? How do you feel like the trainings have been helping you boost some of your skills?
Yeah, that's really kind of you to say. I think that there's a lot to say about the value of the sacred rights training. And I think for me, being in a community with fellow scholars of religion who are also invested in public scholarship just felt really validating and refreshing and motivating. To me, writing is so much about, we were just talking about this before we started recording, um, how tough writing can be. And so for me, it's very much about managing your mental state and the anxieties and the doubts that come with the worth of what you're doing, and in some ways can be very isolating. And so for me, like feeling motivated and supported is not something I take for granted. And I think just being, in a cohort of other people who are very invested in public scholarship just um, was very energizing.
Wonderful. Well, do you have any thoughts on the risks and the rewards and the responsibilities of doing this? Because you could, hide and like just do academic stuff behind paywalls, but you're not. So tell me a little bit about that.
I like that framing, especially of responsibilities. I think, I mentioned in this conversation this sort of issue of underrepresentation of people from minoritized backgrounds in academia. And so for me, this larger reflection about responsibility is also really closely tied to accountability and the question of who are we accountable to? Who are the communities that we're writing to and for, and how does that align to who we're writing about? And I think that question is has been the kind of key to grounding myself, to bring my scholarship in alignment with who I am. Because otherwise, with the reality of academic gatekeeping, as you just mentioned, of paywalls, of university library access, of prohibitively expensive university press books, if you're like for me, if I feel like if I'm not engaging in public scholarship, the thought of me writing only writing for mostly white fellow academics can feel really isolating. And I want to be able to hold myself accountable to these communities beyond academia, especially the ones that I'm a part of. Um, and I think as far as rewards, these recent pieces that you've highlighted here with on reality TV, it's been really great to think about how to pursue writing that I think is fun. And that's been such a different creative experience and a very critical, coming back to where we started, like a very critical pivot away from being shaped by Islamophobia through a lot of my other public facing work. Too, like that my other public pieces have indeed been about Islamophobia, just given the nature of my expertise. But it's been really gratifying to think more expansively this year about what my expertise can allow me to write about.
Wonderful. Well, do you want to give a preview of anything that listeners can look forward to in the future? Do you have anything in the pipeline?
Yeah, so I've been working on a new book project that, as I mentioned, where I'm continuing to think about lived religion, embodiment, national belonging through the lens of entertainment media in the US and UK. And so thinking very specifically about masculinity. And the book is tentatively titled Muslims on Screen, Racism and Sexuality in Anglo-American Islam. And it'll be out with NYU Press at some point. Um, and in it, I analyze how Muslim produced entertainment really offer viewers a window into these internal debates that Muslims are grappling with. So, yes, on racism, but also on sexual ethics, on how they're navigating norms of marriage within Muslim communities, British and American Muslim communities. And I think it helps us understand what it means to live a religious Muslim life as a minority, even if that does not align with what an outsider's expectation of what it looks like to be Muslim could look like. And so shows like Ramy are featured in it, and then Man Like Mobeen, which is a BBC series, We Are Lady Parts, which we were talking briefly about before we started recording, which is about an all women's Muslim punk rock band in the UK. And so these are just it's an exciting time for Muslim produced entertainment, and I think it's been such a rich sort of window into thinking about what these shows tell us about the state of Muslim communities internally, rather than sort of thinking about what Muslims can teach others about themselves.
Wonderful. Do you have a place where you would direct people's attention if they want to follow along?
Yeah, so I'm still on Twitter or X and on Blue Sky. And actually, my faculty webpage at the Danford Center at WashU is also the most updated place where links to my writing can be.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Tazeen Ali, thank you so much for joining me on Classical Ideas to chat about these wonderful pieces and talk to me about TV shows and entertainment and depictions of Muslims in pop culture. Really means a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really fun.